Welcome to CTV's Capital Dispatch with Rachel Aiello.
Welcome to this week's edition of Capital Dispatch. So there's three main things that happened on the Hill this week that I wanted to chat with you about. First, Monday and Tuesday, the focus was really on pharmacare. The Liberals are running out of time to meet their promise to the NDP to pass a pharmacare framework legislation by the end of 2023. We started this week with a bit of a question over whether the NDP were willing to give the Liberals an extension. Essentially, what we were told is that if the government needs more time, they're going to have to do more support for Canadians. Questions remain about what exactly the NDP are asking for there. But then Government House Leader Karina Gold, the person who is in charge of shepherding the government's legislation through the House of Commons, made it pretty clear this week they're not going to meet this timeline. She said, "I don't think it's realistic that we will get a bill passed. Right now, what we're talking about, best case scenario, is tabling a bill, just essentially putting it before the House, not seeing it move very far." Even that metric, bringing forward this legislation, remains a question. The NDP were asked, if the Liberals don't keep this promise, or at least even get to a place where they table a bill, is this the end of your two-party deal? The NDP don't seem ready to go there yet. What we're hearing is talks continue. There's negotiations between the two parties behind the scenes on what exactly this legislation would include. Important note for anyone who's been following this, just because we're talking about tabling and passing a pharmacare bill does not mean Canadians are going to be able to claim pharmacare benefits anytime soon. This is very much just a first step. And that's what's kind of leading into this question of whether the Liberals are still committed to it, because then comes the whole issue of funding. Pharmacare, the PBO has estimated, is going to be a multi-billion-dollar initiative. The government's trying to remain fiscally prudent, keep their debt to GDP ratio down. So there is questions right now about, in this current environment, will this government or this two-party deal between the Liberals and NDP actually get pharmacare done? Or is it going to be put off to be yet another election promise? We're kind of waiting to see on that one. And then the second story happened on Wednesday. We had been following for a while, waiting to see what was going to happen as of December when the Online News Act was coming into effect. We had already heard, and Met has already implemented their block and ban on Canadian news from its platforms, and Google had threatened to follow suit. But Pascal St-Onge, the Heritage Minister, took over the file from Pablo Rodriguez this summer, announced Wednesday that the government had reached a deal with Google that will see that tech giant give $100 million a year to Canadian news outlets, and in return, will continue to allow Canadians to search for the news they need on Google platforms. So this was kind of an important update for the government. They had been grilled for some time over what was then Bill C-18. It's now passed. This is part of the regulatory framework in getting this implemented. To have them have this win, they're really framing this as historic, as going after tech giants, regulating them. But some questions are still remaining to be asked and answered on this one. The government insists no concessions. We'll see what that looks like when the regulations are finally posted. But what made this story more interesting to me is that it could have been just a one-day thing. But Pascal St-Onge, the Heritage Minister, was already scheduled to appear at the Heritage Committee to testify the day after, so Thursday morning. And there, I think the Conservatives wanted to generate headlines about this deal, and they did that. They got a headline about how they were calling on the government, criticizing them for essentially bowing down to big tech, even though the Conservatives have really resisted the government's attempts to regulate. But the headline they got, and likely didn't want, was about their heritage critic suggesting that the Heritage Minister answer her question in English. Obviously, Parliament Hill, Canada's bilingual place, ministers, MPs are free to speak in the language of their choosing. There's interpretation devices available for everyone. But I think what happened here was the minister was answering opposition questions in French. She said because that was her mother tongue, the language she was more comfortable in, whereas some of her questions in English to her Liberal colleagues, her responses, were questioned by the Conservatives. And specifically, Rachel Thomas had brought up this issue of, why are you only answering these questions to certain people in English? Can you please answer mine in English? To which immediately there was an uproar suggesting that was an inappropriate suggestion. The underlying context here, though, is because generally speaking, how things have been working more often than not in the House these days is that MPs are using their interactions, whether it's question period or committees, to clip and then share on social media. So if this MP was getting a response from the minister in French when her predominant audience, she's an Alberta MP, is English, it's arguably a bit less jazzy of a clip to share. And that's really become an issue that we're noticing a lot of, whether or not MPs are genuinely asking tough questions to get to the bottom of things and get answers, hold the government to account, or if they're just kind of trying to outrage farm, as some have alleged. All sides are guilty of this, I think. So that's kind of what made that story interesting this week. And then just lastly, an update on something we've been following, that farm carve-out carbon tax bill in the Senate still has not passed. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre tried to advance a motion this week calling on the unelected Senate to fast track and get this bill passed. That motion failed. The Liberals in the Bloc voted it down, suggesting that the Conservatives were putting undue pressure, improper pressure on the upper chamber to do their job. Meanwhile, the Conservatives are arguing that it's actually the government threatening senators to not pass this bill. Bit of procedural back and forth on this one. Ultimately, though, it has not passed. There's still an amendment on the table, more debate to come. So we're going to continue to watch this file over the next couple of weeks. There's really only a few weeks left if this bill is to pass this year. Otherwise, it could remain in limbo for months to come.
There are things we can do in the short term to unlock supply that exists today. There's new measures that the finance minister has put in place around short-term rentals. Think about Airbnb, for example. My view in a housing crisis is that if a municipality determines that you have an opportunity to put homes on the market for families to rent for the long term, then you should do that instead of making them available for a few days at a time.
So that was Housing Minister Sean Fraser speaking on Tuesday during a press conference about the government's new budget implementation legislation. Essentially, Freeland has now brought forward a bill that's going to implement all of the measures she promised in the fall economic statement presented last week. But one big promise was missing. And despite, as you heard here, the minister tout how the government is going after short-term rentals like Airbnb, bringing through these new tax changes, those measures were not included in this fiscal update legislation. I noticed this immediately. This is one of the biggest promises coming out of that fall economic statement. Their pledge to go after the property owners of short-term rentals in regions where there are restrictions limiting what they can claim on their income tax, essentially an incentive the government thinks to try to turn some of these short-term rentals into long-term stays, more homes for families. So I asked government officials, like, what gives? This was one of the biggest promises in this fiscal update, and you're not moving forward with legislation on it right now. And what I was told is that essentially tax changes like this typically require consultation and then legislation. So this is going to be a bit of a delayed promise. The government is still planning to have this in effect for the 2024 tax season, which does give the government a bit more runway to get this moving forward. But I just think it's important for everyone to note one of the biggest promises from the government's fiscal update, this Airbnb crackdown, they're not moving on it yet. Legislation still to come. Okay, so what am I watching next week? Well, unlike Minister Fraser talking about measures that have not come forward in legislation, there are a number of measures the government is really going to be facing the pressure to get passed soon. As of Monday, just 2 weeks are left in the House of Commons sitting calendar before the holiday break. And so they're really going to be focused on moving forward that Affordable Housing and Groceries Bill, as well as this Freeland Fiscal Update Implementation Act. Expect some debate on that next week. But the main things I'm really going to be watching for in the days ahead are happening at committees. So House of Commons committees, sometimes they can kind of go on in the background and you don't really notice, but sometimes they've got a roster of witnesses that are just must tune in. And there's 3 happening on Monday alone. So there are going to be a series of public safety and health officials talking about Canada's opioid crisis. There's going to be the lawyer for the families of the Bernardo victims testifying about his controversial transfer. And remember that promise for grocery CEOs to come back and tell MPs about their plans to stabilize prices? Well, the first one of those is happening on Monday. Michael Medline of Empire is going to be back before the House Agriculture Committee speaking about the efforts they've taken so far. You'll remember there has been some frustration on the minister's part, suggesting that these grocery CEOs haven't been as transparent as they could be with Canadians about the measures they say they're taking to try to get grocery prices under control. This will just be the first. The committee has recommended or suggested, maybe even summoned, some of these other grocery CEOs to show up. So we're waiting to see what gives. They've kind of blown past the deadline they had to come back and talk. So this one will be interesting, but I think there will likely be more to come in the weeks ahead. But given a limited runway before everyone gets out of town for the holidays, we're waiting to see whether or not that's going to happen this month or into January. So that's kind of what I'm watching for. But as always, I want to make sure you know that you can subscribe to the CTV newsletter version of Capital Dispatch, where I go into a bit more detail on some of these, provide you key links to some of the stories I've written. So if you ever want to get a bit more context on something or information, be sure to head over to ctvnews.ca/newsletters and subscribe for the newsletter email version of Capital Dispatch, this video you're watching right now. Until next week, I'm Rachel Aiello. Thanks so much.